everyone! Welcome to my first YouTube channel. We're going to be called Cooking with Isis today. My first recipe that I really wanted to share with everybody was my albondigas. My albondigas just is a little bit different. It's usually made with beef, ground beef, but instead I'm going to be using ground chicken today. It is a two-step process. So first what we're going to be doing is making the meatballs first, and then frying them off in the frying pan, and then we'll move on to the actual soup. So right now, I'm gonna go ahead and start off with the chicken. Also, I actually use two bowls here, so you'll see this a lot coming from me. I like to use a dedicated prep bowl and then also my garbage bowl. What the main focus is for this is that way, whenever you're prepping, whenever you're sitting here cutting all your vegetables, setting everything up for yourself, you're not constantly going to the trash can and throw all of your stuff away. It just makes things a lot easier, a lot less going back and forth like you're saying. I mean, I don't have a ginormous kitchen, but when you have just your trash can in a different corner of where you're working, it just makes it hard going back and forth. Here I have actually 2 pounds of ground chicken. I'm gonna go ahead and drop it in the bowl and then just drop it in there. It makes it a whole lot easier than constantly opening all your stuff. Okay. And I like to keep my meatballs kind of a little more simple. A lot of the times you'll see cooked rice in it, but I actually am gonna end up putting the rice in the broth itself. So I'm not gonna add rice to my meatballs, but I do like to keep the flavor profile really high. So I use cilantro a lot of the time. I love cilantro. There is some people that cannot handle cilantro, but in Mexican cooking, cilantro is a big deal. So I like to be a little bit heavy-handed on the cilantro in this recipe. I'm also going to be using, obviously, our main focus is salt and pepper, and then we need our 2 eggs for the binder. We're going to add garlic, and then we have oregano, cumin, and coriander. I love these flavor profile together. It's used commonly in Mexican cooking. You'll see that in menudo and pozole, and well, we're also going to see that in albondigas as well. So I'm going to go ahead and start with cracking my 2 eggs into our chicken, and then after that we'll start cutting up all the garlic. All right, so we're going to be using 2 cloves of garlic for this recipe. One of the harder things to mince is garlic because it is pretty small. My nails help just a tiny bit just to make sure I don't cut myself. But you never want to use this little root end right here. I always take that off. And with garlic, you really want to make sure that you chop it fine, especially in applications where you don't pre-cook it. A lot of the times whenever I am making burgers or meatballs, I often like to pre-cook my garlic. I'll try to make sure that I cook it in oil first because it is a really strong and pungent ingredient. Something that does help though is if you mince it very, very finely. All right. Scoop everything up. Drop it in. Okay, and now next we're gonna go ahead and start chopping up the cilantro. So depending on the application, like if I was gonna be making guacamole, I would make sure to pick each and every leaf off of it because I don't prefer to see the stems in the guac. When it comes to applications like this where they're melded into something like chicken that's gonna get cooked, I don't really care. I'm not super particular on getting the stems, so I'll just go ahead and take a knife and cut off a little bunch just like that. The more you cut off, in this case, the better. We are going to chop this pretty fine, but I want to be able to see everything whenever I mix up the meatballs. So I'm going to go ahead and start with, I would probably say about a loose half cup. Okay, and once you get it to a fine mince like that, I'm going to scoop that up as well. And then drop that into the chicken. And now time to rinse off your garlicky cilantro hands. So now we're gonna go ahead and start dropping all of our spices. I am a little bit particular on how much of which ingredient I do. Oregano is really strong, so you should not do more than maybe like a teaspoon per pound of chicken, so I'll probably put about 2 teaspoons of that. Cumin is also very strong. I feel like it's very overpowering if you use too much. So same thing, I probably won't even do more than half of a teaspoon of this. And then coriander. Coriander is actually the seed of where cilantro comes from. So I think it marries very, very well, especially if you have fresh cilantro in your dish. I'll probably be using about a teaspoon of that as well. Okay, so now we're going to start measuring in our spices. So coriander gets a whole teaspoon. Ooh. Okay, maybe a little extra than a teaspoon. And then our cumin and oregano will get half of a teaspoon. And then a half teaspoon of oregano. And then of course, we are always gonna end with salt, pepper, and then I do add a little bit of oil just to add an extra bit of body and a little bit more smoothness to the meatballs. Okay, and then our last ingredient is our panko breadcrumbs. So this helps bind everything along with the egg. It is important because sometimes your meatballs will get a little bit too soggy, so panko breadcrumbs really help you out. If you try to use other breadcrumbs, it does make the meatballs just a little too heavy. Panko is just really light and it's really airy. I prefer to use panko breadcrumbs over regular breadcrumbs. So just a little bit of a dash. A little bit of chicken. And now the best part is mixing with your hands. You don't want to try to take a bit like this and mash it. That really compacts all the meat too much. You want to try to keep everything light. Do more of folding with your fingers. Just makes for a better ending texture. Okay. All right. Okay, so now I make all the meatballs and I place them inside of the bowl. You're gonna want to try to cook everything all at once. The part that's gonna take you the longest is actually forming the meatballs together. So make all the meatballs, keep them, we're gonna lay them on the side of the bowl. Once all of them are pretty much done, we'll start the frying pan and then we can cook them off from there. So depending on how big you like your meatballs, this can make anywhere from like 12 to 24. I like mine generally small. I like to keep them bite-sized. If they're too big, I just feel like they don't sit well on the spoon. It's a lot more effort to eat them. That one was actually even kind of too big. So I'll make them just about that size. Okay, so I just finished forming all the meatballs. It looks like one big mess, but as soon as you just pull them off, they'll come off pretty easily. So after this step, ideally, obviously the point of all of recipes and meals that you cook, you want to make sure that everything is finished all at the same time. So now that these are all prepped, I'm going to go ahead and put this off to the side and then start bringing all the ingredients up to make the soup and the broth for it. I'm going to go ahead and start with the soup. The broth is going to start off with a mirepoix, so that is celery, onions, and carrots. And then we're also going to add a little bit extra, so we're going to be adding 1 jalapeno, 1 white pepper, and garlic as well. After that point, once we've sauteed it a little bit through, we'll add the broth, do the potatoes and the zucchini, and then let that boil through, then we'll start cooking the meatballs together. So first, with celery, we have all this extra piece in there that we don't need. It's a little too fibrous, so we'll cut that off. Drop that into our garbage bowl here. And then you'll want to do the same for the other end. So we'll go ahead and cut these up a little bit thicker than I normally would. I think it just provides for a better bite. You'll get one vegetable per spoonful, but it makes for a beautiful presentation at the end. Okay, next we're going to start chopping up the carrots. Same thing with the celery, you want to make sure you cut this end as well as the top. And then you always want to make sure that you cut all of your vegetation about the same width. So we're going to go a little bit thicker on this as well. And now the onion. Okay, so after all of our celery, carrots, and onions are cut up, we're gonna go ahead and start prepping to cut up the garlic and the 2 peppers, just so that way once the celery, carrots, and onions are all cooked through, we'll be able to drop that right after. You don't want to cook them all together. These do cook a lot faster. We are mincing them up a little bit smaller. We just want to make sure that everything cooks evenly. So just like any other pepper, the hot part are actually in the ribs as well as the seeds. You don't want to include all the seeds in your dish. So we're just going to cut this up nice and thin. And then just 2 cloves of garlic. Okay, so now that everything is all chopped up, we have our garlic and peppers along with our celery, carrots, and onions. We're going to go ahead and go back to the pot so we can start sauteing everything. So my burners are a little excessive, so you should want to try to keep it at a medium, but on my burner it looks like it's going to be low, but they're really hot. I'm going to go ahead and drop our olive oil. And then all of our veggies. And pepper. Just make sure you keep stirring it to make sure that the carrots don't, the onions and the celery don't burn. And then salt and pepper as you go. So now that everything is sauteing, the carrots and the celery and onions will take the longest, so you want to give them a head start. But now that they're soft, we're going to go ahead and drop our peppers and our garlic. So just scoop everything up And then head to the pot. And stir. Just need to let them saute for max 3 minutes, and then after that we'll be able to drop our tomato sauce and our chicken stock. As we're waiting for everything to saute, I want to go ahead and start prepping the zucchini and the potatoes, so that way after we drop the chicken broth, the rice, and the tomato sauce, we just drop everything else and we'll start moving on to cooking our meatballs. Potatoes. As is in the rest of this dish, you want to make sure you cut everything just about the general same size so everything cooks evenly. Now that everything is nice and sauteed, we're going to go ahead and drop our rice. I like to do this at this point instead of just boiling it. It gives the rice a bit of a chance to brown a little bit, develop a little bit more flavor, and then meld with the current flavors already in there. It just lets the rice soak in just a little bit better. Now that the rice is nice and sauteed, we're going to drop our tomato sauce. Stir that in. And our chicken broth. Okay, so now that it's boiling, I'm going to go ahead and dump the zucchini and the potatoes. Whenever you dump a lot of vegetation like this in boiling water, you want to make sure that you drop everything as close to the water as possible so that way you avoid any splashbacks. So, stir. And now we can move on to browning the meatballs. So now we're going to go ahead and start our pan for the meatballs. Now the idea here isn't to truly cook them all the way through. It's just enough to brown them, and then we'll cook the rest of the way in the soup. And start dropping meatballs. Make sure you adjust your heat so that way you get a good sear. And now that our meatballs are nice and brown, I'm going to go ahead and start scooping them into the soup. Everything has been boiling. We've dropped all the meatballs. The potatoes and the zucchini are nice and soft. We're all done. It's a very chunky soup, but the broth is also super amazing.